Chapter 8, Fractures. The king's letter arrived in 2 days, not 3, it came by royal courier, a young man who had ridden without sleep and arrived at the Thornwood border with the king's seal and a level of personal terror he was doing his best to contain in the presence of the border guards. He was brought through under escort. He handed the letter to Erevan. He asked, with barely concealed desperation, whether there was somewhere he could sit down. Thessaly took him to the kitchens. Erevan brought the letter to Saoirse. She read it at her desk while he stood by the window. The morning was grey, the first overcast sky she'd seen in the Thornwood, the canopy swallowed in low cloud, the light flat and diffuse and oddly intimate, as though the forest had drawn its curtains. The letter was long. Her father's handwriting was nothing like her mother's, cramped and angular, the hand of a man who wrote a great deal and trusted no secretary with anything that mattered. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the grey sky for a moment and said, "He's known since before I was born." Erevan said nothing, waiting. "My mother told him," she said, "what she was, what I would carry. He married her anyway, not the king's consort, not a political arrangement. He chose her." She paused. The shape of her father, which she had carried for 24 years as a particular geometry of neglect and use, was shifting under her hands like wet clay. "He kept me out of the succession, out of politics, out of everything visible, not because I was illegitimate, because visibility was dangerous, because people had been hunting the third bloodline for a century and he was the only protection I had and he was terrified of doing it wrong." "He didn't tell you," Erevan said, carefully, not accusing, just naming the fracture. "He didn't tell me," she breathed. "He thought ignorance was armor. He was wrong about that." She looked at the letter again. "He says Caden found out 8 months ago. A servant who'd known my mother, who remembered things. Caden went to my father and demanded to know if it was true, and my father confirmed it. He thought Caden deserved to know, and that was when everything began to move. Caden contacted Vythan shortly after." "Yes." She folded the letter, held it. "My father says Caden is being held at the Ember Throne pending the council's decision. He says he will accept whatever reparation is determined." A pause, very small. He says he is sorry for the silence. He says he believed it would keep me safe and he understands now that it kept me ignorant instead, which is not the same thing." The room held this. Outside, a wind moved through the Thornwood canopy, a long slow sound like the turning of an enormous page. Erevan crossed from the window to the desk. He didn't sit, he crouched beside her chair, bringing himself level with her, which put him close and slightly below her eyeline and was somehow the most disarming physical arrangement she had encountered from him yet. Like he had decided that this moment required him to be reachable rather than formidable. "Saoirse." His voice was very quiet. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with an expression that had nothing tactical in it at all, just that open, careful thing that she now understood was what he looked like when he had simply decided to be present without managing it. "You were loved," he said. "Badly, and from a distance, and in ways that cost you things you deserved. But you were loved." He held her gaze. "That doesn't fix what the silence did. But it changes the shape of it. Slightly." She felt something move through her, not grief, exactly. Something more like the end of a long, bracing, the slow release of a tension she had held for so many years it had started to feel like structure. She reached out and touched the leather cord at his wrist, the worn one, the one she had wondered about since the first morning in his study. Her fingers rested against it lightly. "What is this?" He looked down at it. Something moved across his face, private, old, not painful but not easy either. "It belonged to Aaron," he said. She went still. "He was my friend," Erevan said quietly. "Before he was your father. We served the same border for 30 years. He paused. "When he died, I was the one who found him. I took this from his wrist before I buried him because I couldn't." He stopped. Looked at the cord. "I kept it. For 80 years I kept it without knowing there was a daughter. without knowing he had left anything of himself in the world still living. She could not speak for a moment. "You've been wearing my father's bracelet," she said, finally. Her voice was not quite steady. "I have." She looked at him, crouched beside her chair, close enough that she could see the ash mark at his collarbone, could see the places where his absolute control had been worn thin by 8 days of her, could see the man underneath, the general who had carried grief for 80 years and was only now learning what it had been grieving toward. She took his hand, both of hers around his, the cord between their palms. She held it and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that was not made smaller by words, and he seemed to understand this because he did not say anything either, just let her hold his hand in the grey morning light with the thornwood moving outside the window and her father's bracelet warm between their palms. They stayed like that for a long time. The fracture, when it came from the direction she had stopped watching. She had accounted for Caden, secured at the Ember Throne. For Vython, now under council supervision. For the 2 unnamed men who had hurt Marin, whose descriptions had been circulated to the border guards. She had built her map of the danger and believed she understood its edges. She had forgotten that maps have edges because cartographers run out of knowledge, not because the territory does. It was Marin who saw it first. Marin, recovered and restless and possessed of the particular sharp attentiveness of someone who had nearly been killed and had since decided to be extraordinarily observant about her surroundings. She came to Saoirse's study in the afternoon with the look she got when she had noticed something and was organizing it into words. "The young soldier," she said. "The one who smiled at you on the first morning. The one the general told to stop." Saoirse remembered. "Yes. He has been in the corridor outside your room 3 times today. Not walking through, standing. Looking at the door." Marin's voice was even. "And this morning I saw him speaking to the courier. Before Erevan received the letter. They spoke for less than a minute and then separated." Saoirse was already standing. "Did Erevan's guards process the courier before he entered the citadel?" "Yes. Standard search. But the courier carried the letter in an inner sealant case. Standard practice. The case has 2 compartments. The second compartment. Where is the courier now?" "The kitchens. With Thessaly." Saoirse moved. The courier's second compartment held a single item, a vial. Small, dark glass, sealed with black wax. The kind of container that alchemists used for compounds that degraded in light. Thessaly had the courier by the arm before Saoirse reached the kitchen doorway, and the young man, barely 18, terrified in a way that had passed performing and gone fully genuine, was talking without being asked to. He had been given the vial by a man he didn't know in the city 2 days ago, told it was medicine for the princess's handmaiden who had been injured, told to pass it to the soldier inside who would see it administered. He had not known what it was. He said this with the desperate sincerity of someone who understood that whether he was believed or not would determine something significant about the rest of his life. Thessaly looked at Saoirse. Saoirse looked at the vial. "Where is the soldier?" she said. "I don't know," the courier said. "I swear." The alarm horn sounded, not the 3 short one pattern of a border crossing. 2 long blasts, close together, then silence. Inside the citadel, Saoirse and Thessaly looked at each other. "Your quarters," Thessaly said. They ran. The eastern tower corridor was empty when they arrived. Empty and wrong, the way a room is wrong when something has just happened in it. The door to Saoirse's study was open. The young soldier was on the floor of the corridor 10 feet from it, not dead but not conscious, and Marin was standing over him with the fire iron from Saoirse's hearth and an expression of tremendous composure. "He came through the study window," Marin said. "From the outside. He was at your desk." She looked at Saoirse. "He had a knife." Saoirse stepped past her into the study. The desk had been searched, quickly, roughly, papers displaced, the border records volume knocked to the floor. The window was open, cold air coming through it, and there were marks on the outside ledge where someone had climbed. She looked at the desk, at the displaced papers, at what was missing. Her mother's letter. It was gone. She stood in the empty study with the cold air coming through the window and felt the loss of it, the particular, irreplaceable loss of her mother's handwriting, her mother's voice in ink, gone now into the hands of someone who wanted to understand exactly what Saoirse knew and when she'd known it, and she held the loss for exactly 3 seconds before she filed it and turned and walked back into the corridor. Erevan was there. He had come fast, he was always fast when the alarm sounded, and he had taken in the scene with one sweep and was now looking at her with an expression that was simultaneously the general assessing a situation and the man checking if she was hurt, both happening at once, neither suppressing the other. "I'm not hurt," she said, before he could ask. Marin handled it. "The soldier was looking for my mother's letter. He took it." Erevan looked at the unconscious soldier on the floor, then at the open window. "He went out this way. He's still in the citadel. That ledge only runs to the next tower and back in. He has nowhere to exit without passing a gate." She looked at Erevan. He wasn't acting alone. Someone gave him instructions specific enough to know the letter existed, to know what it contained, to know what losing it would cost me. "The second player," Erevan said. "Not Kaidan, not Vythan." His voice was controlled but barely. Underneath it was something hot and contained, the first real anger she had heard from him. "Someone who has been in this longer than either of them. Someone who was watching all of it," she said. "Watching Vythan's plan. Watching my arrival. Watching the council session. Waiting for the right moment to take something that couldn't be replaced." She looked at him. He looked at her. They were standing in a corridor with an unconscious soldier on the floor and a cold window open behind her and her mother's words stolen out of her chest, and Erevan's expression was doing the thing it did when he had stopped managing it, all of it present, nothing held back, the gray-green of his eyes gone, a color she had no name for and did not need one because she understood it completely. "We will get it back," he said. Quiet and absolute. "I know," she said. "I will personally." "I know," she said again, softer. Not stopping him, just confirming that she believed him, that she had learned, in 8 days, to believe him about the things he said with that particular quality of absolute. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so natural and unpremeditated that she was certain he hadn't decided to do it, that it had simply happened, and she watched him realize it had happened and watched him decide not to take it back. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. Once, then his hand dropped and he stepped back and became fully the general again, efficient and purposeful, turning to Thessaly to issue instructions about the soldier, the gates, a search of the tower. But she felt the warmth of that touch settle against her cheek like a brand, small and certain and entirely his. She pressed her own fingers to the spot, briefly, once. Then she straightened, and turned toward the open window, and began to think about who had been watching long enough to know about the letter. They found the soldier 2 hours later in the lower archive, cornered between the shelving and the far wall, letter still in his coat, looking like a man who had run out of options and was waiting to see which one arrived for him first. It was Erevan who arrived first. Saoirse 3 steps behind. The soldier, Devran, 4 years in the citadel, 21 years old, recruited by the same slow machinery of debt and flattery that turned minor functionaries everywhere, handed over the letter without resistance and gave them a name. Not Kaidan, not Vythan, a merchant, Eastern capital, old money, the kind of man who financed destruction from a careful distance and called it commerce. He had understood, before Kaidan did, that Saoirse was the fulcrum everything turned on. He wanted the Covenant gone not for territory but for trade routes, the removal of every Sylvain border restriction on the eastern commerce roads. The opening of a continent. "He's not in the Thornwood," Saoirse said, when Devran finished. "He's been operating through proxies from the beginning, which means we cannot arrest him through Citadel authority alone," Erevan said. "No." She touched the letter through her collar, restored, back where it belonged. "But the king can. I give my father this name, he has the chain from merchant to Kaidan to every proxy in between. It's enough for a formal accusation and seizure." Erevan was quiet for a moment. You'd need to return to do it in person. After the equinox. After the covenant is resealed. She met his eyes. That's the priority. He held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted. The warmth permanent now, beneath the surface of everything, and something else moving through it. Something that was thinking about after the equinox and what it contained and what it did not. The resealing requires the spring equinox, he said. 3 weeks. Then I'm here for 3 more weeks. After which you return to the Ember Throne. She understood what he was actually saying. She had been thinking about it too. The particular arithmetic of a near-immortal man and a woman whose years were entirely human in their counting. She had kept it at the edges of the thing she was building with him, trusting they would reach it when they reached it. They had reached it. Erevan, she said. I'm not raising an objection, he said. I'm naming a fact. I know. She stood, crossed the room to his desk, closer than any of the corridors, closer than the archive. She looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the familiar compression of being near him was no longer unfamiliar at all. It was like coming back to a room she had been many times and found always warm. The equinox is not the end of this, she said. It's the beginning of what comes after. And what comes after involves things not resolved by me returning to the Ember Throne and you remaining in the Thornwood. She held his gaze. I'm the last of the 3rd bloodline. The covenant renewal requires me here annually. That is not a problem. That is a reason. He was very still. A reason, he said. Among others. The Thornwood sang its evening song below the window. Saoirse looked at him, the ash mark, the shifting eyes, the leather cord at his wrist, and said, when the equinox is past, when everything is answered for. She paused. You told me to ask. Yes. Stay, she said. Not here, not there, somewhere that is ours. Choose me. Not the covenant, not the bloodline, not the politics. Me. His eyes, at this range, went completely still. Not controlled, just still, the way deep water is still at its clearest. Then he reached up and framed her face with both hands, that same tucking gesture, both sides now, deliberate and asking, and looked at her from the small changed angle and said, yes, quiet, absolute, no room for revision. She breathed. He rested his forehead against hers and they stood there as the Thornwood sang and 3 weeks of equinox stretched ahead and everything after that stretched further still. She thought, I came here against my will, carrying a secret I didn't know I had. She thought, I am leaving, eventually, on my own terms, carrying something entirely different. She thought, some things are inevitable not because the world forces them but because 2 people pay enough attention to each other that inevitability becomes the only honest word. Outside, the first stars appeared through a break in the cloud. In the eastern tower, Marin was probably reading. Thessaly was probably updating some private record with tremendous satisfaction. The archivist was probably translating something by moss light. And in a study overlooking the silver canopy, Saoirse of the Ember Throne stood with her forehead against a general's and let herself be, for the first time in her life, entirely chosen. End of Chapter 8. Next, Chapter 9, The Name of the Killer.